Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
What makes us Canadian? It's a question generations from the Pacific to the Atlantic, all the way to the Arctic have contemplated, but takes on new significance today.
This is the land that Terry ran, the land the Gord sang about. This.
Yes, we are those things, but we are also a country that took Indigenous children from their families, that forced them to live in residential schools, where they were abused and sometimes died. We are a country with much work to do in terms of writing a dark legacy, and that work comes into focus today. I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with Assembly of First Nations Yukon Regional Chief Kluane Adamek on this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation about confronting the pain of the past and present and reconciling for the future. Chief Adamek, it's such a pleasure to be speaking with you again. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you.
This year's Truth and Reconciliation Day comes, of course, against the backdrop of Bill C-5. And just a quick refresher for those listening, that's, of course, the bill that would give Cabinet unfettered control of all projects deemed to be in the national interests. Many Indigenous leaders are concerned about the impact of that legislation on their rights. I wonder if you think this legislation undermines the spirit of reconciliation as we prepare to mark it.
I first want to acknowledge that I attended the First Nations Summit with the Prime Minister and Cabinet and rights holders, specifically chiefs from across the country. And I heard a number of issues with respect to rights, recognition, and ultimately, the impacts of unilateral decision making with and by the federal government. As you may know, I also very recently was appointed as part of the Indigenous Advisory Council for the First Nations Major Projects Office. And so I'm still being fully briefed, if you will, on exactly how and what that council will look like. And so, the perspective I bring is one of course, coming from a northern part of the country where we have a modern treaty. So essentially, we've defined our Section 35 rights on our territories. So it's very clear in my nation the process by which major projects could or would occur. We have the Yukon Environment Socioeconomic Act. And so that act sort of binds First Nation and federal and territorial governments together to identify what the path would be to do sort of that environmental and socioeconomic assessment on a major project. So breaking that down, I think what's really important to note is that the North is very different, and there are already major boards and legislation that provides a path forward for process and at the end of the day, looking to whether something would be approved, particularly with those nations with self-government and land claim agreements. So when we talk about the country and rights infringement and issues, do want to acknowledge that the reality for, hundreds of nations across this country is very different than my own. And in this case, I think it is important that we better understand what exactly this is going to look like. And that sort of, I think for me, it's the cautious optimism. There's no doubt that, in my view, could we have waited? Could we have been sort of full partners at the table legislatively? Absolutely. I understand the pressures federal government has been feeling. We've been feeling those pressures in terms of issues around sovereignty for hundreds of years. So, that part, many things can be true at the same time. So I think at this point, I definitely feel strongly that we need to take a serious look at, how as advisory council members we can support the federal government on getting things right, But I also, at the same time, want to acknowledge that and wouldn't disagree that there were, some missteps, some processes that could have been really different. And to try to find at this point in time, what is the best path forward? And, that's not to make concessions or to sort of overwrite any of the issues or to say that they aren't important from a First Nation rights perspective. It is to say, and what are we going to do now? And that's sort of been, I think, ultimately for me, as an IAC member, still being very much onboarded, the focus and after discussion with my chiefs around what could this look like? What does this mean for the Yukon? How can I be, an ally at the table? So that's sort of where and how I see things with respect to Bill C-5. But undoubtedly, there will be legal challenges. There will be, processes by which First Nations are going to determine what the best course of action is for them.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that, because what do you make of the Prime Minister's insistence that Indigenous rights will be respected and they will be full partners? How do you think that will play out, just given, as you've laid out, that every nation across this country has different needs and different wants?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's new. It hasn't been done before. So I think that's something important that we have to acknowledge, is that this is a different way in which we're looking at major projects across this country. So that's, I think, the first step. The second part is and as advisory council members, to be really clear, it's not, we're not sort of yes, this project can be deemed and this can't. Want to be super clear about that. It's really about how can we give, our best advice to support the Major Projects Office with the mandate that it has. And recognize that, it was interesting. I had a number of calls after the list was released and people saying, what's Kluane? Tell me more. Like, who are you there representing? What, and having a lot of questions. And I think ultimately bringing diverse perspectives on this is really important. And participating, in my view, as a Northern First Nations woman who has experience working, particularly in the space of climate change and the environment, that to me is a really important part of all this work, because governments last for a season, and the longevity that we need to be thinking about as a country, Canadians and First Nations people, needs to be longer than any election cycle. It has to be about the long-term opportunities for our kids, and that ultimately, I think for me, is going to continue to be at the forefront of the work, and we'll navigate as best I can with my colleagues, but importantly, continue to be supported by my region in terms of considerations that I'll have the opportunity to bring to that table.
In the broader context of reconciliation, Bill C-5, very similarly to Ontario's Bill 5, for instance, it seems to reflect this sort of broader trend among governments across Canada that are invoking economic urgency to kind of justify maybe curtailing consultation with Indigenous peoples. Is that a fair assessment?
I think there's a lot geopolitically that is at play, and a landscape that we haven't seen before. So, when things are happening in the news so quickly, every day it sort of feels like there's something new that we need to respond to, and so it's like almost like a vortex. When it comes to the advancement of from a First Nation perspective, and again, speaking from that place of my own nation, there have always been processes, plans, ways by which First Nations govern themselves and their territories. So when I think about development projects, as I shared, in the North, is very different than the rest of the country. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from the North. It's also balancing some of the complexities that exists when it comes to numbered treaties, provinces, territories, the federal government, and what the process looks for this rapid, ever-changing geopolitical landscape that we're in. And when it comes to the question around Canadian sovereignty, in my view, we can't have a conversation about Canadian sovereignty without talking about reconciliation, without talking about economic reconciliation, and without talking about land. And that's ultimately, I think, when it comes to reconciliation, one of the big parts of that conversation. There's, the calls to action, and those are really important. And it's also a question around how do we deal with this ongoing issue with respect to land? And that's a hard conversation. Each part of the country within each nation, has their own processes that intrinsically they've had for centuries in being stewards of the land. And so now that we're in this space where we're trying to talk about reconciling, that to me seems to be one of the biggest issues that is challenging but very important, is how do we bring in economic reconciliation? How do we bring in land as part of these discussions around Canadian sovereignty? Because certainly from a First Nation perspective, you're hearing First Nations from across the country say, well, what about our sovereignty? Our sovereignty is important. This is, we didn't sort of ask for all the things that have been brought to us, right? It happened, and not on our terms. Development, colonization, all these pieces. So I think it really is propelling those discussions right across the country. And there are pressures. I think it would be irresponsible not to acknowledge that there are significant pressures as like a nation state that Canada is dealing with. But let's not leave, and we cannot leave rights holders behind.
And I do want to acknowledge, too, that, not all First Nations are opposed to this bill. There are some in Alberta, for instance, who see Bill C-5 as an opportunity. And as nations, all are entitled to, whatever form of economic development that they want. I wonder how you reconcile that with other, nations who say these economic resource projects are just not what they need. They need clean water. They need better roads. They need stronger internet. How do we get to a point of economic reconciliation when there are just two competing needs here?
But and I think that's exactly what we do need to talk about, though, is that why is it that we're also looking at, in my view, yes, some of the major projects largely we're talking about, could be oil and gas, could be mining. There's also infrastructure needs. And a lot of these communities do need infrastructure. So when we're talking about, a major project and looking at sort of the neighboring nations, what is it that's needed to ensure that we can support, or not we being me or anyone else, but that like in general, that project could be supported, right? There's also hydroelectricity, there's wind energy, there's clean energy projects that I think are really important that we're also thinking about in this frame as major projects in this country. So that's one of the first pieces that I'm really interested in learning more about the major projects office and sort of how is it going to be broad. The second part is, how do we look at ways to support? And these are conversations that are happening in my own region when it comes to like Arctic defense and security. So, okay, Alaska Highway went in and hugely devastating to the region. First Nations were not a partner. The U.S. Army came in and made the highway, and the impacts that were felt are still felt today in terms of the, lack thereof respect for rights, disrespect to Indigenous women, substance issues with respect to those who were building the highway, and what that impact and how that infiltrated our communities. So I think that the Alaska Highway is a really good example of how things could go terribly wrong. And so now, instead, when they're talking about a potential Navy base or we're talking about Arctic security, I see that so linked to potentially major projects to say, well, what kind of community infrastructure is actually needed on the periphery to even support something like this? And that's where I'm really interested in looking at doing things differently. What are the long-term opportunities, risks that that need to be considered when we're talking about climate change and these major projects? So again, like at the table, and we haven't met yet. So there's lots that I look forward to being briefed on. We haven't finalized in terms of reference to be really transparent and clear. But those are the considerations when I think about major projects that I do feel there could be interest from a whole number of communities to say, okay, if there is going to be this type of major project, is how will our community be a partner in that? And how will our community be at the table? What will that look like? These are really important questions that nations are asking and that they should ask. Um, and I think that's where it will be really looking at the major projects office and working through things over the coming months to start to think about how things can be done differently and how our projects be prioritized. I have a whole lot of questions too. And I look forward to definitely like diving into things a bit more. But I also think diversifying the way that we think about what major projects could be is also really important.
You mentioned earlier the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. It's been almost 10 years since the release. Only a small fraction has been completed to this point. Many, still in progress or not even started at all. I wonder if you've had any indication from the new Carney government that they are committed to following through and implementing more of these calls to action.
Well, I mean, some would say, is advancing in the way that they're advancing in alignment with reconciliation? Great question. I welcome those conversations. In my view, one of the biggest, I think, questions around where are we at with advancing reconciliation is sort of looking at, as you mentioned, like how much progress has really been made. And when I say that, I mean as individuals in our own circle. So whether it's our family, our place of work, our social connections, our communities, how are we advancing reconciliation? It cannot be on the shoulders of Indigenous peoples. And it does, I would say, as a First Nations person, it sometimes feels that way, right? Like we sort of are asked, or how should we approach this day? Who should speak? What should we do? And you do your best to give your best advice, but to be candid, it's really tiring actually to always be the person that people go to. And I'm not saying it's just me. There's tens of thousands of us out there as Indigenous people, millions, if you will. We are looking at Métis and First Nations and Inuit. So I think the biggest thing is, how are we as individuals in community and sort of the next circle looking to then our broader connections and then organizations, governments, doing our own report card and saying, how are we doing? Like, am I advancing what I need to advance? I know tomorrow, or this week rather, having a national holiday, some see it as that. It's a holiday. And I think it's important that it was a federal statutory holiday. I do think that is important. At the same time, I hope people are using that day to also take a pause and reflect and learn. And I'm I find that that's an interesting part of the conversation, right? Like the day, there's lead up events, there's always Orange Shirt Day events. All of that is important. But also, are you taking time out of your day to take a pause, to commemorate, to acknowledge, to bring truth to educate yourself on this history that we share that largely wasn't shared with all Canadians? It was a really deep and dark hidden part of our history as a country. And when it comes to these major projects, all of that is relative. All of it is connected. And I would love to see for those nations, and one of the biggest issues that I think is facing communities when it comes to these big projects is support for capacity to even respond, right? You've got, maybe there's a huge opportunity in your territory, but and you have, the best and the brightest in terms of your people. Um, but is there enough for you to be able to, as a nation, make decisions, come up with a plan, identify those opportunities? And I think capacity in so many nations, when you're dealing with, a suicide epidemic, or you're trying to respond to opioid, fentanyl, and substance abuse issues, or just in general colonization, having to boil your water, not having access to and mold-free homes, like the list goes on. It's a lot when then you get this, potentially a project that could happen in your territory, and there's just not the resources or capacity to respond. So I really hope to see a whole lot more by this federal government and industry to say, let's just equip the nations to be able to have the conversations they need to have, as opposed to going in and looking for a yes right away. That I think is a really important part of the work. And it's, in my view, it is a responsibility absolutely aligned with the TRC recommendations that nations need to be able to have the capacity to even respond. So that is something that I think is really important that we see.
For Canadians outside of those communities, how should they, for instance, engage with legislation like C5 that directly impacts Indigenous nations, so that, they are meaningfully supporting a reconciliation?
Well, I mean, here, you look to each region, there's, an Assembly of First Nations regional office. So like here in the Yukon, the Council of Yukon First Nations has a ton of information about our agreements and what that looks like in terms of development. In Ontario, for example, the Chiefs of Ontario have been very strongly and vocally so against, provincial and federal legislation, and have provided some really great information as to why. So I think it is, compelling Canadians to take some time to look at your local organization, look at your regional organization, look at the nation whose territory you reside on, and better understand their positions and why. I think that is the responsibility of every Canadian to really have a deeper understanding of where you fit from sort of settler and or new Canadian reality. Where do you fit and sit as a guest on these lands? What does that look like? And learn more about the nation whose territory you're on, to understand where and why they have the positions they do.
I wanted to ask you on a personal level, what National Day for Truth and Reconciliation means to you, and how you reflect on it.
Yeah, it's I would say for I think a lot of people, and for myself, it's can feel like a really heavy day, because my grandmother went to residential school, and so there's certainly intergenerational impacts that I feel by her experience, um, through my dad and so on. So it's a hard day. I think especially so now that I'm also a mom and I have a 2.5-year-old, and could not fathom how those parents must have felt when someone came to take their children. And I know there's stories of kids going as early as age 3, 4, 5. Like I cannot imagine in my core how that would feel. And so I think it's also brought a deeper, perhaps a different intensity being a mother now, and thinking about what my grandmother what her parents would have gone through when they sort of took my grandmother away at the age of 5, and how terrifying it would have been for those kids, and then all of the abuse that they endured. And I think that's something that's really important for Canadians to know. It's like, yes, I will be showing up wearing my Orange Shirt Day shirt or pin, because that's important. I'm It's also a day to commemorate what it is that the survivors went through, because I just can't imagine what that would feel like as someone going through it, a parent seeing it. Um, it entirely tore apart the very fabric of who we are as people, and we didn't ask for that. So I think it is a day that is important, a day that requires recognition and commemoration. But it's not always an easy day for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, because it does bring up a lot. And so for you, those of you who have Indigenous friends, it's I think also a really good day to say, hey, how are you doing? Like, I just want you to know I'm thinking about you. Because it can bring up a lot. I was on the plane, and Bones of Crows, good series, suggest viewers take a look at that. It's intense, and I was watching on a plane ride recently and had to sort of take a minute. I'm like, wow, like this is so real and so raw. Um, but Canadians have a responsibility to sit with those feelings too. To really know and to be able to sit with the fact that that is real and raw, and that did happen. And we can never, as they say, the elders will say, we will never forget, but we will never let it happen again. And that's sort of, I think, the reminder for me as a parent now, the importance of her knowing and understanding that history, but also her knowing that I as her mom, her dad, my husband, our family, but also the country, will never let that happen again. And all that's happening in, geopolitically, sometimes feels like that. That whole concept of letting individuals be hurt is somehow okay right now geopolitically, but I have hope that in Canada we will stand strong with each other to ensure that there is no hurt to any child in this country, no additional hurt that's propelled by, policies, legislation that sought to divide, that every single child in this country has a right to be safe, to be whole, to be loved, and that as Canadians is and continues to be important to all of us.
Chief Adamek, I really appreciate you taking the time today to sit with me and chat. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was The Big Story. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and if you did, please share it with a family member or a friend. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. You can also send us feedback on this episode or any other by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Caryn Ceolin.